Matthew 5, verses 31 to 32. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 to 9. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let man not separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery."
Good morning again, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to come along this morning to the Sunday morning service of MCC. Again, if you don't know me, if we ever met, my name is Matt, and I'm one of the leaders here at MCC. And again, particularly if you're a visitor amongst us this morning, it's fantastic to have you along. Just to kind of put you in the picture, for the last couple of weeks here, if you don't know, we've been undertaking a sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount. Last week, we went through the topic of lust and adultery. And if you want to catch up on that, the talk, like all the others, should be on our YouTube channel. Or it is on our YouTube channel. This week, we're going to spend some time looking at the next little "you've heard it said, but I tell you" example that Jesus gives of what living under his kingship looks like. And that example, as you've probably guessed, is all about divorce. And I suppose that makes sense in that, just like lust and adultery that directly precedes it, divorce is concerned with intimate relationships. As I wrote in the church email out this week, it needs to be acknowledged from the front here that divorce is horrid, it's hard, and it's even sometimes necessary. And regardless of the circumstances leading to it, or who initiated it, or even if it was unavoidable, it always seems to leave everyone who's been involved, it leaves them wounded, and likely, I'd suggest, scarred. And hopefully it goes without saying, but just to make it abundantly clear, this talk is not about downplaying the pain of divorce. It's certainly not about trying to make light or minimising the immense struggle that marriage relationships can entail. And it's most certainly not about throwing rocks or casting stones. Whatever anyone in this room has or hasn't done, and perhaps feels bad about as a result, I, for one, can't look at the entire Sermon on the Mount honestly without facing up to the fact that I am still riddled with faults and guilty of not loving God nor my fellow humans in multiple ways. And as I spoke about last week, my individual sins, if you like, aren't the most important thing to acknowledge. Whether I lust, whether I covet, whether I divorce when I shouldn't, God forbid all of the above, these are important to note, but they're secondary as well. What I have to constantly face up to admit and to say sorry for, and strive to change with the Holy Spirit's help, is that I'm sinful, full stop, and thus no inherently better, superior, or different than anyone else here in the room. Divorce sucks. It has long-term consequences, but at its worst, if you like, at its absolute worst, even if it could have been avoided, should have been avoided, it's still only a sin. And by that I mean it can't outbad, if you like, the love, the grace, and the forgiveness of God. We aren't that powerful, if you like. We can't outdo, even with how marred we are, we can't outdo the love, the grace, and the forgiveness of God. So if it helps, hold on to that quote from Thornton Wilder that I've used at least once before and slightly altered. In God's service, only the wounded soldiers can serve. I think that's a fairly accurate take on how the church should look and feel to people, both inside and out. So with that little intro, here's where we're going today. We're going to look at the original Old Testament teaching on divorce that Jesus refers to. Secondly, we'll examine what the likely beliefs were about divorce at the time of Christ and the Sermon on the Mount. Thirdly, we're going to unpack Jesus' teaching that he gives here, and also later on in Matthew chapter 19, in response to the challenge that the Pharisees kind of throw down to him. And then lastly, we'll spend some time working through some possible implications for here and now. Now, there's lots of info here, and I'm not going to apologise for that. It's dense. It's a complex topic, and the last thing that I wanted to do was kind of rip the can off like a whole lot of worms, throw it at you guys, and then walk away after 15 minutes. That wouldn't be fair. Given what this means to people and how relatively common it is and how so many people are affected by it, I wanted to do it justice. So it's going to take some time. It's heavy as well in nature, so I also didn't want to kind of spend 2 or 3 weeks going through this as well, because I thought that just may be too much for people, first and foremost myself. So I have kind of put it all into one talk. So I'd encourage you, again, if you need to afterwards, look it up on YouTube once it's up there, if you want to go over some of the stuff again. Okay, so firstly, the Old Testament context. And it's important to note, Jesus paraphrases here. So he doesn't quote directly from the Old Testament, but he paraphrases from the book of Deuteronomy, specifically chapter 24, 1-4. So he says, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." And these are the verses that he's referring to in Deuteronomy 24. "When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favour in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife," etc., etc. So there's a certificate there of divorce. Now, this was written in the context, obviously, of a patriarchal society. It's worth noting that. But it's also worth noting that the degree of protection that this system provided a woman back then. The certificate the husband had to provide and produce afforded the woman, his soon-to-be ex-wife, with some protection. It showed and demonstrated that the divorce hadn't occurred due to infidelity or some example of adultery. Because if that had been the case, then the woman would have been exposed to a much harsher fate. This means that whatever is meant by that phrase, indecency, it wasn't sexual unfaithfulness. It was something else. That, of course, begs the question, what was that something else? What was that indecency? And this seems to be a notoriously hard question to answer. The Hebrew term that is translated indecency, or in other versions, uncleanliness, it's only used in one other place in the Old Testament, and that was in relation to defecation. So it's a bit of a mystery as to what was entailed here. However, the thing that we can be pretty certain about is that the degree, if you like, of divorce that it allowed under this clause was supposed to be the exception and not the rule. It was supposed to be very narrow in terms of its definition and scope. Its boundaries were supposed to be here. And we know, that it was never designed to be easy to justify a divorce. And the reason that we know that is thanks to Jesus' other teaching on divorce in Matthew that we heard Helen read out before from chapter 19, after the Pharisees asked Jesus about divorce. Jesus, in response to that question, he stresses that marriage is something God uses to join men and women together, to become one flesh. And as a result, they shouldn't be separated. Why then, the Pharisees ask, why does God, via Moses, why does he allow the certificate of divorce thing to happen in the first place? And this is Jesus' answer to that question. Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, that is the creation of men and women, it was not so. It was not so. So, kind of bringing all that together, the Old Testament background to divorce that Jesus refers to in Matthew 19 and in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, was that it was always a concession. It was a regrettable accommodation to the brokenness of humanity. It was a last resort, if you like. It was never part of God's original plan design, and intent for humanity. So that's the Old Testament. Now let's move on to the time of Jesus and the recording of the Sermon on the Mount. Things had changed, and they changed quite dramatically. Whatever indecency or uncleanliness had originally meant had just exploded in meaning. So at the time of Jesus, believe it or not, a man could divorce his wife for serving him food that had been accidentally burnt. Divorce could come about due to finding something displeasurable about your spouse. So, that little idiosyncrasy that you found so adorable when you were dating is now just driving you nuts day in and day out. Divorce, you could do it. So the historian, Dale Allison, he wrote of the time, the impression one gains from ancient Jewish sources is that divorce was relatively easy and was not considered a grave misdeed at the time of Christ. And also, it wasn't just husbands divorcing their wives. Wives could initiate a divorce against their husband. So check out these quotes. They're actually lifted from actual certificates of divorce from the time and just reflect on how strikingly modern these sound. So the first one is from the perspective of a husband. Let this be from me your writ of divorce, letter of dismissal and deed of liberation, that you may marry anyone you want. The text of a writ of emancipation is as follows. Again, a direct quote. Lo, you are free, girl. Lo, you are your own possession. And then from a wife's certificate, I, Shalom Zion, daughter of Joseph Kebshan from En Gedi, with you, Eleazar, son of Hananiah, who had been my husband before this time, that this is for you, from me, a bill of divorce and release. You were free. You were released. You can marry anyone you want. Reading these didn't square away with the stereotypes that I at least had about how prescriptive and restrictive marital life would have been at the time. I found it pretty shocking. Now, of course, there were exceptions. There were groups that were completely against any form of divorce. But generally speaking, the mood had shifted from Old Testament times and moved to having become more permissive, if you like. In some, it was easier to get divorced, and it wasn't viewed as being a tragic last resort the way it was in Moses' day. People, like the Pharisees in chapter 19, for example, they weren't so much concerned anymore with the reasons for a divorce as much as just making sure that people got that bit of paper, stuck to due process, and did the right thing in the eyes of the law. So again, just as we've read in so many examples of the Sermon on the Mount, the heart condition is downplayed or ignored. So that's the context at the time of Christ. Thirdly, let's move on to Jesus' teaching on divorce, both here in the Sermon on the Mount, but also as we see it recorded in chapter 19. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So that's straight from the sermon. In chapter 19, so again, same book and same language, same Greek terms. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except, again, for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on the making her commit adultery part, except to say I think it makes it clear that Jesus is saying here that there is permissible divorce and ones that aren't justified. And a consequence of an unjustified divorce is that the husband and wife are still one flesh in the eyes of God. They actually haven't separated, again, in the eyes of God. Hence, if they end up with someone else in that state, it becomes adultery in the first instance because they're still joined. Look at the text. Jesus is saying divorce can lead to adultery and that it's impermissible except for, apart from, sexual immorality. And suddenly, a lot hangs on the definition of this phrase, sexual immorality. And alas, this also is tricky. Matthew uses the same Greek word in both of these verses. The Greek rendered to English is porneia or porneia. And it's hard to nail down a specific definition based on the usage of this word, porneia, in the New Testament. I'll spare you the details now, though please feel free to grab me afterwards if you want to hear a bit more about the background of that word. But this is a definition that I am happy with based on the research that I've done. And I'd say this is like the kind of consensus position as well. Sexual immorality / porneia, it refers to the more general sense of sexual sins that break down the marital covenant. So this would include adultery, but it's not just adultery. There's a different Greek word for just adultery. It would include incest, which is prohibited in other parts of the New Testament. It would likely include premarital sexual activity, but that is not what it's referring to here in this context. In modern times, it may include a serious porn or fantasy life issue that isn't being addressed. So it's a bit of a blanket term, sexual immorality, which I know makes it difficult. But Jesus says this is the exception that warrants divorce. Now, I know some of you will be understandably wondering where things like domestic violence specifically sits within this. That's a great question, which I'm going to come back to later. Scott McKnight, New Testament scholar, who's been a wonderful resource both on this topic specifically and also the sermon in general, he has what I think is a really useful approach that I wanted to share with you guys about this. His theory is that to get our thinking straight on divorce, we need to get it first straight on marriage. And to understand marriage, we first need to get a good handle on what we mean by love. And love, for us, followers of Christ, is first and foremost found in and defined by God. Love starts with God. And what does God's love look like? Well, McKnight says it's a covenant love. It's a commitment. And that commitment that God makes is to be with his people and for his people. And to be for his people, to be for them until they are fully redeemed. That is, he's working to form his people into the Jesus-like creatures that he originally designed them to be. So with them, God is present with his people. He's alongside them. He's for them. He's working for their best interests. And what are those best interests? It's for complete redemption. He's working to form them towards being the people that he specifically designed them to be. That's covenantal love. Secondly on this, in terms of God shaping love, we see what love looks like in practice in the relationship of the Trinity, the God that is one and yet three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So theologians have long talked about, discussed, posited how the Trinity involves the three persons mutually indwelling, like a fairly common phrase in those circles, at those kind of parties, if you go to those kind of parties apparently, mutually indwelling each other. And this is a bit of a mystery, right? But bear with me. Mutual indwelling in the Trinity involves the members of the Godhead, the three, delighting in each other and influencing each other and being influenced by each other, working in complete unity with each other, serving each other, whilst all that time maintaining their distinct personhood. The Son is still the Son and cannot be replaced by the Father. So if you put those two elements together, covenant and Trinity, I think you have a picture of ideal love in marriage. I'm with you. I am for you. I am doing what I can to see you fully redeemed, to become the Jesus-like individual that I know God wants you to be. And we remain two separate people, but at the same time, through our delight in each other, our service towards each other, our so well knowing each other, we kind of indwell each other. We profoundly influence each other. In marriage, to become one flesh. And as a quick aside, you'll note that that kind of conception of love, minus the sexual element, that's not exclusive to marriage. Very close friends and family can fall under that conception of love as well, as they should, I think. So marriage can, and ideally will, reflect this love of God. Divorce destroys that. So what does the Bible say that God hates divorce? Why does Jesus say people shouldn't separate what God has joined together? Here's a large reason why. It takes something that should reflect the image, glory, and love of God and distorts it. And then you add the sexual element on top. And we don't have the time to go into that this morning in detail, but that sexual element is a big deal. So if you check out Paul's teaching on this in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, 12 to 20, he writes, "Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his/their own body." Please hear me. Sexual immorality isn't a worse sin in the eyes of God. Like we discussed last week, there is no hierarchy of sins. But in terms of consequences, it's different. It's different from every other type of sin. And I think if you've had any experience, you know that. You know that. So bringing this all together, Jesus is fiercely for marriage. He taught that divorce goes against God's design pattern for his people. But here in the Sermon on the Mount and later in Matthew 19, he acknowledges the sad fact that we live in a fallen world that is just strewn with our hard hearts. So there are exceptional circumstances in which divorce is a conceded, regrettable path. And the exception he cites is sexual immorality. And hopefully I managed to explain that it's not because of the sexual immorality per se, but because of how sexual immorality destroys that covenant love that we described before. You can't be with someone, you can't be for someone, you can't be working towards someone's redemption and being sexually immoral at the same time. The two are incompatible. So is that it? Is sexual immorality the exception? Is that the only thing that can torpedo that covenant in a way that is irredeemable and warrants divorce? Scott McKnight says no, and I humbly agree with him. And here's why. After Jesus, the Apostle Paul, who would have been more than familiar with Jesus' teaching, he adds another situation in which divorce and remarriage would be regrettably acceptable. And that is if your non-Christian spouse leaves you. Paul teaches that, Paul teaches not, he doesn't teach that you chase them, that you try to persuade them, or that you even remain married to them. He doesn't say if you're left by your non-Christian spouse, remain celibate in their wake. He says you're released. You are released. In some translations, you are no longer enslaved. What's the logic here? I'd say it's the same as the case of sexual immorality. That covenantal love has been demolished beyond repair. You've left me, so you're not with me. You're not for me anymore. You are not working towards my being fully redeemed. And I can't really do the same to you either. Now, please follow me here. If that's the logic behind permissible divorce, that is covenantal love being demolished beyond repair, then I think domestic violence and abuse fits here too. And by that I mean physical, psychological, emotional, and financial abuse. If the behaviour is compromising someone's physical safety, if it's intentionally wearing someone down constantly or trying to control them, and there's no repentance in the form of working hard to change and actually changing that behaviour, then that also is going to demolish a covenantal relationship. Because you can't be for someone if you're abusing them. And it's hard for them to be with you and for you. It's hard for you to be with them and for them if you are being abused. Now, there may be other scenarios that are almost always irreparably damaging to a marriage covenant, but I haven't thought of them yet. But they have to be that serious in order to warrant divorce. And that brings us to our last section. What may this mean for us here and now? Firstly, as a group, we need to constantly recommit to doing what we can to strengthen marriages, both current and future. So as I've said, marriage reflects the love and the faithfulness of God. He joins people and makes them one flesh out of two. We need to honour that. We can't go looking for outs. I'm not sure if no. Stanley Howells wrote, again like another good theologian, if we come to this text, so specifically the Sermon on the Mount, the section on marriage, or Matthew 19 on divorce, if we come to these texts about divorce and we're looking for reasons to justify divorce, we have completely missed the whole point. So strengthening marriages means that when marriages are in trouble, we'll be striving for reconciliation. We'll be working towards preserving the marriage. And this may not be the case when abuse is involved and someone's safety is jeopardised. There's a different process for that. But I'm referring to those cases. I'm referring not to those cases now. I'm talking more about the troubles and dissatisfactions that arise from marriages feeling loveless, or being misunderstood by your spouse, or the way too frequent arguing or conflict, or simply the times that you find yourself more attracted to someone else, that kind of thing. We as a church, in response to those scenarios, should be gently, humbly, but actively encouraging reconciliation and restoration. Surely there should be a marked difference between how we handle it within the church and the subsequent divorce rates and what goes on outside the church. Our default response to marital problems can't be something like, wow, that sounds tough and complex, and we'll pray for you, and then just leaving it at that. That's not really being active peacemakers. That's not being agents of reconciliation. Ooh. Thanks, Adrian. Now I went too far. Okay. Secondly on that, let's begin by teaching on and presenting a true and beautiful picture of love and marriage. And let's let that form our imagination, if you like, and our expectations of what marriage entails. In other words, let's be shaped by Scripture when it comes to marriage rather than just being kind of Hollywood and pop culture influenced people of our time. You go back to Genesis 1 to 3 and it shows us right from the start how complicated marriages are. We're designed not to be alone. We've got the capacity for two to become one. But after the fall, we're bent to be at each other's throats, wrestling for control. So we are simultaneously made in the image of God on this side, but we're also creatures that are made from and return to dust. So relationships are as a result, they're going to be wonderful, but they're going to be so complicated. So let's start there and not get sucked into unhelpful, simplistic takes on relationships. Listen to these words by the philosopher and author Alain de Botton. And this guy isn't a Christian, so just take it like that. He's not even a Christian, but this is what he writes in his book, The Course of Love, a great book on the complexities of relationships. I'll read it out because you understand, probably can't make out those words. He writes, by the standards of most love stories, our real relationships are all damaged and unsatisfactory. No wonder separation and divorce so often appear inevitable. But we should be careful not to judge our relationships by the expectations imposed on us by a frequently misleading medium. The fault lies with art, not life. Rather than split up, we may need to tell ourselves more accurate stories that don't so much dwell on the beginning, that don't promise us complete understanding, that strive to normalise our troubles and show us a melancholy yet hopeful path through the course of love. We need better stories, he writes. The irony being that as followers of Jesus, we already have a better story when it comes to love. So perhaps when it comes to counselling and encouraging people pre-marriage or trying to support them through marriage, we need to be soberly upfront just how difficult it can be for two fallen but beautiful creatures to coexist faithfully together for a long time. And we also want to counsel and remind people what marriage is for. It's not primarily for me as an individual or for you as you are now. Again, a non-Christian sociologist, Eli Finkel, he wrote, since around 1965, we've been living in the era of the self-expressive marriage. Americans now look to marriage increasingly for self-discovery, self-esteem, and personal growth. That doesn't square away with our definition of other-focused love at all. Instead of going down that path, we should be heeding the words of author David Brooks, who was a Christian convert in late life. He says, marriage comes as a revolution. To have lived as one and then suddenly become two, that is an invasion. And yet there is a prize. In the committed life of maximal marriage, if the committed life of maximal marriage is viewed the way the scholar of myth Joseph Campbell viewed it, as a heroic quest in which the ego is sacrificed for the sake of a relationship. Ego is sacrificed for the sake of a relationship. Marriage is a hopeful revolution two people undertake together without any real idea of what's on the other side. Hopeful revolution. Ego on the altar for the sake of something greater, a relationship. And I'd say a relationship that can point to God. I really like that. But if that's true, we need to be promoting it as such, because that isn't the main message that is coming through the culture today. And thirdly, we're in this together as a church. Marriages are too important to remain solely the couple's business. Marriages are just far too important to remain solely the couple's business. If you had a religious wedding, you'll remember what's involved. Hopefully some pre-marriage counselling by an experienced couple who walk you through some potentially challenging and personal issues. Then you get married by a religious celebrant who'll mention some version of this being done in the eyes of God and witnessed and supported by members of the church you belong to. You and those witnesses, you follow the same King, Jesus, and we strive to live according to the commands that he's given us. And that includes the command for avoiding divorce. And when divorce happens within a church, regardless of the reasons, even when it's unavoidable, everyone feels it. Everyone feels it. That's not a guilt trip at all. And of course, the order of magnitude of suffering between the people going through it and those surrounding them is incomparable. But this is stating an important fact. Everyone is affected by it. Just like we all benefit, if you like, from healthy marriages. And all this is to say, there is nowhere on that timeline of marriage where it solely concerns and involves just the people being married, just you and your fiance, just you and your spouse. Because that's not how it should work in a church family. We take marriage too seriously for that. We value it more than that. We know it's both difficult and rewarding at times, so we want to do everything we can to support it and see it flourish. That scenario of a sudden breakup or divorce that takes everyone by surprise, that shouldn't be happening in the church the way that it happens in the rest of the world. Because what's going on in our marriages or prospective marriages shouldn't be known just by us, because we're an interdependent church body. Someone else, ideally some couple who you love and trust, they should know the nitty-gritty, the true state of our relationships in order to better support us and see it flourish. They should be offering perspective when things get heated and blurry between ourselves and our partner. And they should be helping us see the warning signs on the horizon and offering us counsel before a molehill turns into a mountain. And they should be praising us and God when things are going well. And ideally, this should be set up at the front end, when things are pretty kind of easy. So when things become difficult, you've got people to turn to straight away. And please hear me, this isn't meant to be culty. This isn't about everyone getting into your business and gossiping about it under the guise of a prayer chain, which is really helpful. This is just acknowledging that we all need those close, access all areas, relationships in life. And that includes in our marriages. And I don't want to seem like I'm harping on about this. I feel strongly about it because I've witnessed these out-of-the-blue relationship breakdowns both within and outside Christian circles. And in hindsight, you think, man, perhaps this could have been different. Perhaps it could have been avoided if the right person or people have been someone outside the relationship, have been involved earlier on in the timeline. The advice, the encouragement, the perspective that right person could have given, that may have altered the entire course of the relationship. Because marriages do end suddenly, but the reasons why they end suddenly, they've often been bubbling around for a long time beforehand. So marriages are too valuable and important to be left solely to the married couple. If you're married or you're contemplating marriage, who plays that role in your relationship? And this is absolutely the last thing, the place of grace. What happens if you think and feel guilty about your relationship ending? What if you now regret the part you played in your divorce or separation? What about if you're angry about a friend or a family member and their separation and divorce? Where do we stand as a church on this? So don't forget everything that's come before about the importance of marriage and us trying to keep them together, all the way from courting, all the way through the marriage prep, and all the way through. That notwithstanding, we live in a fallen and broken world. People will get divorced for what I'd say are inadequate reasons. They'll later feel some degree of guilt and regret perhaps about that. They may or may not remarry. This church should be a community of grace and forgiveness, and much, much, much more so than what people find outside these walls. Unwarranted divorce is not the unforgivable sin. God is powerful enough to do beautiful things through our mistakes. People have been remarried in this church. People will do so again. We don't want people who have repented, who have sought forgiveness, being held hostage to their past mistakes. Again, it goes back to that principle of involving others in the state of our relationships, past, present, and future. We can talk about and pray about what's happened and perhaps what's happening. We can try together to discern what God's will is for our respective lives. And whether people remarry, whether they choose to remain single, you've got a place here. There are no second-degree, second-class Christians here based on marital state. So that's it. Please, again, if you want more info on this, you can look up the sermon series that Jeremy and I think some others did back, it was either mid last year or maybe back in 2019 on relationships. That's another resource where Jeremy, I think, particularly went through a lot of details around how to, try to foster, I think Tim did too, on how to foster better relationships. And also, please, 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 if you've got any questions or concerns about anything that I've said, which would be more than understandable, talk to me after the service, or during the week coming up. I really would welcome this. Thanks.